So before we begin, if you'll allow me, I will do some technical and logistical announcements. I'm Shehnaz Kıymaz. I'm the Women's Major Group Coordinator, and it's a delight today to have all of you with us. Before we begin, I will make some accessibility and logistics notes with you. We have interpretation in Spanish and French available. Please select the language you'd like to listen to, including English, because we'll have speakers speaking in non-English languages today. Please do not remain in the off channel. That makes interpretation quite hard. And I can pause here for a second so our interpreters, amazing interpreters, can do these announcements in their languages.
Thank you, Shehnaz. Para escuchar en español, por favor, en estos momentos, vayan abajo de su pantalla, opriman en donde dice interpretación, interpretation, y luego escojan su idioma. Vamos a hablar en otros idiomas, no solo el inglés y el español, entonces, por favor, a menos que hablen inglés, francés y español, escojan su canal ahora mismo. Si están no conectados desde un celular, por favor, conéctense abajo a la derecha. Hay 3 puntos que dicen More. Hagan clic allí y luego opriman Interpretación, Language Interpretation, y escojan inglés, francés o español. Luego opriman Done, hecho, arriba a la derecha. Gracias.
Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Donc, il y a de l'interprétation en français et en espagnol aujourd'hui. Pour y accéder, vous cliquez sur le symbole de globe en bas de votre écran, vous choisissez français, vous pouvez aussi choisir de couper l'audio original. Ne restez pas sur aucun des canaux, même si vous comprenez une des 3 langues, parce qu'il va y avoir des interventions dans toutes les langues. Si vous nous joignez depuis un téléphone portable, il faut cliquer sur les 3 petits points, choisir à nouveau interprétation de langue, puis terminer. Merci, bonne réunion.
Thank you so much to all our interpreters for the announcements. Now I'd like to note that Maestre Muzumdar will be our accessibility and safety coordinator today. So if you ever have any safety concerns or accessibility problems, you can write to her in chat specifically. The meeting is recorded, as you might see, and it will be shared on our YouTube channel and social media channels as a resource for everyone afterwards. Today and every day, we stand in solidarity with all the feminists who couldn't be here, with all the feminists who are resisting all forms of oppression as we speak throughout the world. As always, discriminatory remarks, hate speech, the denial of self-proclaimed identities, anti-race discourse, other forms of discrimination will not be tolerated in this meeting. If such an incident occurs, the person will be removed from the Zoom platform after one warning. So without further ado, I would like to pass the floor to our Anglophone Africa organizing partner and Education as a Vaccines Director, Toyin, to moderate our meeting today. Toyin. Toyin, is it possible you're not in the English channel, perhaps? We cannot hear you. Is it? Oh, you couldn't hear me, Toyin. One moment, I will stop the screen sharing and restart. Thank you for your patience, everyone. Toyin, in the interpretation, are you in the English channel?
Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can hear you.
Okay, great. Okay, I'm just going to switch my device. Okay, thank you so much. Okay.
Thank you, Toyin.
So, yes, so I want to assume that, because I couldn't hear for a bit, that Shehnaz already gave me the floor. And I want to welcome everybody. Hello, everyone. You're welcome to this webinar. We are so happy to have you here. We're happy to be joined by an amazing group of, feminists and, a collective of women who are activists as well throughout the world for our discussion today. And I want to apologize a little because of my background noise. I'm still at an airport. So welcome once again. This is the Women's Major Group, like Shannon has told us, and the Women's Major Group is an intersectional global feminist collective. It was created at the 1992 Earth Summit in Rio, Brazil. It's an official participant in the United Nations process on sustainable development. The Women's Major Group also has the responsibility to facilitate feminist and women's rights of society organizations and active participation, including sharing information and making input into policy spaces that are provided by the United Nations. It's self-organized, and also it is open to everyone who's interested and organizations who are interested in working to promote women's human rights, especially with the focus on through the sustainable development process. So for us at the Women's Major Group, the SDGs is an important process as well, and the implementation of the SDGs is also key to achieving, what we are individually pushing for and pushing for as a collective. But we are also seeing that reaching the SDGs is, further than, what we had imagined before. And with, the calculations that are being made, it's looking like we're possibly going to reach the SDGs by 2065, according to ESCAP. So we do need bolder steps. We need more ambition. We need more, action to realize this transformative change that we seek. And it is urgent now more than ever. So one of the primary work and focus of the Women's Major Group is the Voluntary National Reviews, and it takes place every year at the high-level political forum. And recently, this year, in July, some of our members have also participated in these VNR processes. So the VNR, we know it's one of the main ways of monitoring and reviewing the achievement of the Agenda 2030. The VNRs and the forums, the regional forums that happen in different regions of the world. So in 2023, the HLPF would address the theme accelerating the recovery from the coronavirus disease and the full implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development at all levels. And 42 member states will be presenting their VNRs in 2023. So today, we're going to hear two testimonies from two feminist activists from the Global South, whose countries presented their VNRs this year, 2022. So we'll hear about the linkages between human rights and the VNRs, and we will also learn how civil society process for involvement at the VNRs at HLPF in 2023 will happen. We'll finish the discussion today with information from first-hand information from the director of the Intergovernmental Support Unit of UN DESA on how the preparations for the 2023 VNR will happen from the side of the UN. So now I would like to give the floor to our first speaker, Rose Pelagie Masso. Rose is the Planning and Cooperation Regional Coordinator at REFACOF Cameroon. Rose, you're welcome, and thank you for speaking to us today. So you have the floor now. You can go ahead.
Bonjour. Excusez-moi, j'ai une connexion vraiment très instable. Ça va et ça revient. Donc, j'espère que je vais pouvoir finir de parler. Et pour cela, je suis obligée de fermer la caméra pour pouvoir avoir un peu une bonne connexion. Donc, je suis Rose Pelagie Masso, comme l'a dit Toyin. et du réseau des femmes africaines pour la gestion communautaire des forêts. Merci déjà de nous avoir associés à cette rencontre pour que nous puissions partager notre expérience sur la préparation des VNR. Donc, je ne sais pas, Shinaz, si tu peux partager ma présentation.
Yes, Rose, it's on now.
OK, merci. D'accord. Je vais donc présenter l'expérience du REFACOF. Le REFACOF, c'est le réseau des femmes africaines pour la gestion communautaire des forêts. Nous sommes un réseau de 20 pays d'Afrique centrale et de l'Ouest. Et le Cameroun abrite le secrétariat permanent et assure également la présidence du réseau. Donc, nous avons participé à la revue nationale volontaire et je viens par la présente partager avec vous notre expérience. Suite. Next. Next. OK. Pour répondre à cette préoccupation, j'ai préparé une intervention en 4 points. D'abord, je vais parler du contexte. Ensuite, la préparation et l'élaboration du rapport sur la revue nationale volontaire. Je vais évoquer quelques problèmes identifiés dans le processus d'élaboration des VNR et je vais terminer par les recommandations ou en quelque sorte les demandes féministes. Next. Prochaine diapositive, s'il vous plaît. OK. En termes de contexte, il faut dire qu'en 2022, tout comme en 2019, lorsque le gouvernement du Cameroun a décidé de présenter les avancées accomplies dans la mise en œuvre des objectifs de développement durable, le REFACOF a entrepris de participer et d'apporter sa contribution à cette revue à travers l'élaboration d'un rapport sur l'évaluation de la mise en œuvre des ODD. Au niveau du Cameroun, le principe de la participation inclusive de toutes les parties prenantes est consacré par le gouvernement, même si dans la pratique, cette participation est plutôt mitigée. Cette année, par exemple, contrairement en 2019, REFACOF n'a pas été associé au processus du gouvernement malgré ses nombreuses demandes formulées à l'endroit du gouvernement et plus précisément aux représentantes et représentants de l'entité gouvernementale en charge de la coordination et de l'élaboration du rapport national volontaire. Toutefois, au niveau du REFACOF, nous avons réalisé une évaluation de la mise en œuvre des ODD et avons produit un rapport alternatif. Next. Next. Prochaine diapo, s'il vous plaît. OK. Par rapport à la préparation et à l'élaboration du rapport sur la revue nationale volontaire, il faut dire que cette phase a été ponctuée par 5 principales étapes. D'abord, nous avons commencé par la mise sur place au niveau du Cameroun de la représentation nationale du Human Major Group pour une contribution efficace et efficiente des organisations féminines dans le suivi et la mise en œuvre des ODD. Après la mise en place du Human Major Group, nous avons informé le gouvernement de la création de ce Human Major Group et avons manifesté notre volonté de prendre une part active sur le suivi de la mise en œuvre des ODD et notre participation au processus d'élaboration du rapport national volontaire. La troisième étape a été la réalisation de l'évaluation sur l'état de mise en œuvre des ODD auprès de 2 groupes d'acteurs ciblés pour la circonstance. Le premier groupe a concerné 4 arrondissements repartis en 2 régions ciblées. Next. OK. Dans le premier groupe, effectivement, il s'agit de travailler avec les femmes les communautés locales, les organisations communautaires de base, le secteur privé, les élus locaux et les administrations locales des arrondissements de Ngaoundéré, 1er, Nyambaka et Menganga. Et là, c'est dans la région de la Damawa du pays. Et un arrondissement, en l'occurrence celui de DA 1er pour ce qui est de la région du littoral. Là, ce sont des enquêtes que nous avons menées auprès des populations cibles. Le deuxième groupe, par contre, portait sur les organisations de la société civile à travers les consultations virtuelles en utilisant l'outil de suivi indépendant. Et ici, c'était l'ensemble du pays, dont les organisations reparties sur le triangle national. La quatrième étape était l'élaboration du rapport alternatif ou schedule report en anglais. Et la cinquième étape, la présentation de la déclaration de la société civile pendant le forum politique de haut niveau. Il faut dire qu'au niveau du Cameroun, de manière séparée, plusieurs plateformes et forums ont préparé des rapports alternatifs. Mais au niveau du forum politique de haut niveau, la délégation du Cameroun a réussi à se coordonner et sortir une déclaration unique pour la société civile. Merci. Next. Prochaine diapositive. Prochaine diapo. J'espère au moins que vous me suivez, hein, parce que ma connexion étant mauvaise et le retard que je constate au niveau du passage des diapos. Merci. Par rapport aux problèmes identifiés dans le processus d'élaboration des VNR, il faut déjà noter le caractère peu inclusif du processus de 2022. Plusieurs organisations de la société civile, à l'instar par exemple du REFACOF, n'ont pas été impliquées dans la revue nationale volontaire. Il y a eu également la non-implication de la représentation nationale Désolé, hein, des soucis de connexion. J'espère au moins que vous m'entendez. Et là l'écran est parti. Shenaz, est-ce que je peux continuer même si on a...
Yes, please. We hear now.
Oui, Rose, continue, please.
Bon, la connexion étant mauvaise, je crois que je vais continuer sans les diapos. Et je parlais déjà de la non-implication de la représentation nationale du grand groupe des femmes du Cameroun, malgré ces nombreuses requêtes auprès du gouvernement pour participer au processus de la revue nationale volontaire. L'implication de quelques Ouf.
Maybe
Est-ce que c'est possible?
Oh. Should we give time?
Est-ce que je peux continuer même si... Est-ce que vous m'entendez?
Okay. Oui,
Allô?
Rose, oui.
I'm afraid the connectivity of Rose is not allowing for us to continue. We can share the PowerPoint that Rose has shared with us with the recording to all the participants today, which outlines her main speaking points. We hope this will be all right, and I can give the floor back to Toyin for our next speaker.
Thanks, Shanaz. So our next speaker, thank you so much, Rose, for the much that you have shared.
Je demandais si je peux continuer sans le partage d'écran. Oh là là.
Okay, I think we can try for another couple of minutes and see. If the connection is fine, you can continue, Rose. But if you're still struggling with the connection, I think we'll just go with Shanaz's suggestion to share your presentation eventually with everybody who has attended. But for now, so I'll just hand back over to you and for the next couple of minutes and see if your connection can sustain the conversation. Thank you. Can Rose hear me? Did she hear what I said? Hello. Okay, I think I'm going to move on to the next speaker. Our next speaker is Cham Perez, Executive Director of Center for Women's Resources in Philippines. Cham is going to share with us her own testimony from
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Am I audible?
Yes, Cham.
Okay.
Participating in the VNR process this year. Over to you, Cham. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Toyin. Again, my name is Cham Perez from the Center for Women's Resources in the Philippines. It is a research and training institution supporting grassroots women's organizations. We have been following and monitoring the SDGs process since 2015. Thank you for the opportunity to share on the experiences and perspectives of civil society organizations in the Philippines. As you know, the Philippine government has presented its VNR for the third time in July this year. It is also the co-chair of the groups of Friends of VNR. It was also the chair of the APFST last March. It is the regional process on the SDGs. So it seems like the Philippine government has been doing a lot in the implementation of the SDGs, even setting itself as an example for other countries. But what is the reality on the ground? And I will be speaking first briefly on the state of the SDGs implementation in the Philippines. So in the Philippine VNR report last July, the Philippine government mentioned new policies and programs that it implemented in response to the pandemic. It talks about innovations in the economy using digital technologies. It mentioned developing a pandemic response playbook, including provision of IT gadgets for students, but it never mentioned what it has done on significant issues that relate to the most marginalized in the Philippines. There is no mention of land distribution or about substantial increases in wages and social protection. It does not talk about halting extractive industries. Even if we have enacted laws on the protection of women and children, we have laws on reproductive health, they are not fully implemented and monitored. On the other hand, those laws that restrict democratic civic spaces, like the anti-terror law, have been rolled out to silence the voices of the people seeking social justice. In its VNR report, it also said that the pandemic reversed some of the Philippines' achievements on the SDGs. But the setbacks and regressions are not really surprising for us. The Philippine government, its blueprint for the SDGs implementation is the Philippine Development Plan, which in itself is problematic. Why? The Philippine Development Plan is anchored on the neoliberal development framework that for decades has led us to greater poverty and hunger, to more dispossession and dislocation and violation of women and people's rights. It is profit-oriented, it puts private capital and business first over the people. And so we say that so long as the government adheres to this framework, we will never achieve the SDGs. And this is what we have been bringing in our engagement in the VNR processes to address these systemic barriers. Now, let me talk about our experience as civil society in engaging with the VNR. In the Philippines, we have this so-called Stakeholders Chamber, which is a multi-stakeholder platform to discuss, understand, and facilitate partnerships for the achievement of the SDGs. So for us in the civil society, while we welcome this kind of initiative on the side of the government, we are actually alarmed at how government consultations with CSOs are undervalued and are taken for granted. The process, although yes, open to civil society, but it is not very inclusive. For one, it requires actually organizations to submit all sorts of documentation, from organizational profiles to accomplishment reports that we are implementing the SDGs, even requiring endorsement letters from government agencies or development partners. And, of course, not all organizations can comply with these requirements. Another observation is that there is a tendency to accommodate stakeholders whom they deem can fund or mobilize resources for SDGs implementation. So what we have been seeing is a couple of corporations and businesses in that stakeholders chamber, while community organizations or those who are doing more of policy advocacy are we remain unheard, sidelined, again in favor of businesses and corporations. I'd also like to mention that the VNR report was released very late this year, and it was, I think, only a week before the HLPF that we got hold of the report. So this means that there is still a lack of effective implementation of institutional mechanisms to include women's voices in these processes. Another point is, okay, if CSOs are able to access the space, our question is, how does the government genuinely consider our voices, especially when we raise critical issues and systemic issues like trade liberalization, privatization, when we raise concerns on the impacts of austerity measures, when we talk about debt cancellation, for instance. Before civil society or us in women's organizations and community organizations, before we engage in policy dialogues as in the VNRs, we go through this process of building our collective positions based on our concrete experiences. We collectively analyze the situation and we carefully formulate our recommendations. We even use participatory methodologies. And it is very disappointing and enraging when our governments do not listen to us. And this is the reason why we would go to regional and global spaces in the APFSD and the HLPF, where we can bring our demands and our recommendations. And we are actually very thankful for civil society mechanisms that facilitate CSO engagement, like the APRSEM at the regional level and at the global level. Of course, we have the Women's Major Group and the MGoS. But another point that I would like to make, and this is very important, is the shrinking and closing of democratic space that hinders inclusive CSO participation. I'll give the example of a labor and trade union activist in the Philippines. Her name is Loy Magbanwa. For decades, she has been fighting for workers' right to decent work, against labor flexibilization, for workers' right to unionize. She's a staunch women activist. She disappeared and has been missing for 5 months now. And before that, she has been experiencing a lot of harassment and surveillance from state forces. And Loy is only one of the many, many women who are experiencing various forms of attacks. In fact, from 2016 to 2021, there are at least 62 Filipino women human rights defenders who have been victims of political extrajudicial killings, and more than 130 women are currently imprisoned due to trumped-up criminal charges. And it is only because these women are challenging the current system and they are pushing for genuine development in their own communities, in their own capacities. And they have been doing this even before the SDGs, even before the Millennium Development Goals. And, you know, if you think about this, it is actually incoherent and a regression to the targets of SDG 16 and 17. Maybe to wrap this up, I would like to forward our demands. First is that governments need to actively seek out and support the participation of women, girls, gender diverse people in all aspects of development processes. And when we say all aspects, that is from the creation, implementation, to the monitoring and evaluation of these programs and policies. This also includes establishing and maintaining institutionalized spaces at all levels, at different levels, from local to global, where we can effectively engage. Of course, we demand to ensure a safe and enabling environment for the work that we do. Thus, there is a need to stop all forms of harassments and attacks against us, against women's rights organizations and defenders and service providers. And finally, there is a need to ensure policy coherence of development policies and programs to international human rights commitments that is centered on women and people's rights and not centered on the interests of a single political family, for example, in the Philippines, or centered on the interests of business or for private sector profit. So I'm going to end there.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Cham, for sharing your experience from the Philippines. So now we're going to hear from Maria Soledad Pazo. Maria is the Senior Human Rights Officer at the UPR Division of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Maria is going to speak to us about human rights and the VNRs and the Office of the High Commissioner's guidance notes. Over to you, Maria. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Toyin. It's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. I'm really delighted to be connected and to participate in this initiative that gathers many feminists from all over the world. I'm really honored. My name is Maria Soledad. I am a woman human rights actor and defender from the Global South. I'm a native Spanish speaker. I'm happy to see that there will be interpretation in Spanish as well as French. and I'm working in OHCHR Geneva at the Universal Periodic Review for over 2 years now, and I was part of the team that helped to shape the human rights and VNR guidance note that I will share with you today. Can someone please project the presentation? And is everyone able to hear my voice?
Yes, we are able to hear you, and the presentation is coming in a second.
Thank you. So let's start from the beginning, because that's the last one. Up. So now, can you project the
Seem to be at the beginning, perhaps? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, the next, please. So my objective today, and I hope not too ambitious, is twofold. First, to disseminate and trigger your interest in this new tool called the Human Rights and VNRs Operational Common Approach Guidance Note, and to stimulate a discussion on opportunities for gender equality, intersectionality, and increased participation in development rights-based VNRs. Next, please. The next. Thank you. So this new practical tool was launched at the High-Level Political Forum 2022 to support member states in integrating human rights into the development of voluntary national reviews on the 2030 agenda. As you know, putting rights at the heart of sustainable development is a strategic priority under the Secretary General's call to action. And it was developed with the idea in mind that significant opportunities exist in bridging closer together human rights and SDGs, and having VNRs that are stronger analytically by integrating human rights, and of course, thinking of a human rights-based approach. As you know, the participation of civil society, human rights actors is an indispensable element. So the development of this guidance was an interagency effort and jointly led by UNDP and OHCHR with contributions from across the system. Next, please. Next slide.
So there's a slight delay in the slides coming, refreshing, but it should be up now.
Great. So as you know, 92% of the Sdg goals and targets correspond to international human rights or labor rights. So the obvious premise is that we will not be able to deliver on the 2030 agenda without also working towards fulfilling all human rights for all. And that's the premise. The SDGs are grounded on human rights, and there is a high degree of complementarity between the goals and human rights obligations of member states. So the best and most effective and efficient way to do this is to learn how to reap the benefits of complementarity between VNRs and the work of the global and regional human rights systems. So this guidance was developed to support member states to do exactly this. Take full advantage of the synergies between human rights and SDG processes to boost effectiveness and efficiencies of both efforts and have an amplifying effect. This guidance is a complementary resource to the existing guidance that we have, which is a UN DESA handbook. I'm sure you all know it, and the UN Secretary General Voluntary Common Reporting Guidelines for member states. So many important entry points for human rights are included in the current VNR handbook and the guidelines from the Secretary General. This complementary guidance aims to highlight these, the entry points, unpack them with relevant resources and examples, and therefore support member states in taking this forward through specific step-by-step guidance. One of the key elements of the guidance note is the criticality of gender equality considerations, intersectionality and opportunities, and meaningful participation of civil society at all stages of the development of VNRs. Please, next. What is included in the guidance? There is an overview of the human rights system and the complementarity and entry points that exist in VNR processes. We really wanted to emphasize that the wealth of information, particularly on populations left behind, is available through human rights recommendations from mechanisms and the reports that are gathered by states, stakeholders, and populations for engagement with human rights processes such as the UPR. The guidance also explains what existing reports, complementary reporting requirements, and data are likely to exist, and how to coordinate between government bodies working on human rights and those working on development, which, as you know, don't always speak to each other. The guidance also elaborates on the importance of human rights-based approaches to leaving no one behind, collection and analysis of data, meaningful participation of stakeholders, how to engage human rights actors in VNR preparation and follow-up, and also 8 steps with practical checklists. The suggestions and insights are drawn from a review of VNRs submitted by member states to date and builds on these good practices and illustrative examples that I'm going to comment some of them at least. Please, next. So, there are 3 main sections with subsections. The first one is introduction. The second section is named VNRs and the Human Rights System, Benefits of Complementarity. And the third one is called 8 Steps Towards Developing a VNR that Integrates Human Rights. My main idea here is to briefly point you to the various entry points for civil society, human rights actors, social feminist movements in these VNRs. And you will see a strong role of civil society, human rights actors in the second and third section. The second is more conceptual, and the third section is more the practical application of the various concepts. These contain the 8 steps to develop VNRs and integrate human rights, each with checklists. I really invite you to have a look. So in the second section, as I said, we have subsections, and you can see them in the slide. Leaving no one behind, HRVA to data, meaningful participation, engaging human rights actors. From the onset, we highlight that gender equality is at the heart of human rights and UN values. And the VNRs provide opportunities to assess progress and gaps in implementing SDGs from a gender perspective. It is crucial that VNRs reflect how a gender perspective is mainstreamed in the planning, budgeting, implementation, monitoring and evaluation of national SDG strategies and COVID-19 recovery plans. So we encourage that good practices and experience with strengthening gender equality strategies in recent years be included, and also use of gender statistics, the disproportionate impacts on women and girls from the pandemic, as well as any other crisis, humanitarian emergencies, financial shocks, etc. This, of course, will happen easily if women's and girls' organizations, feminist groups, and women's human rights and environmental defenders are included in the preparatory process of the VNRs.
Sorry to interrupt, Maria. So some participants are asking that you take it a bit slower.
Oh, okay. Sorry about this. Okay, I have a tendency to speak a bit fast. So what I was saying is that, of course, it will be much easier that the gender perspective happens if we have the possibility to participate, if women and girls organizations are included in the preparatory process of the VNRs. And intersectionality is key in the guidance. And this is relatively new because we haven't been using the concept of intersectionality a lot in guidance notes. And it is important because it really brings to our attention that it's critical to really understand the impact and experiences of those subjected to intersectional vulnerabilities. In HRVA to data, the guide explores these principles in which, of course, meaningful participation is emphasized and understood as enabling participation, because, of course, it should lead to including much more data apart from the one that the usual statistical offices collect and provide. Then we have meaningful participation in this subsection. Of course, I don't have to tell you too much. It is clearly underscored that the contribution of views and information from different sections of society involves much more than consultations, and that it includes active involvement in formulating strategies to achieve goals and targets. The guide suggests as a good practice that women and girls and persons with disabilities are consulted across all goals. And there is evidence indicating that participation and multi-stakeholder dialogue in VNR processes as created are important, and they provide a very, very important, unprecedented political traction for civil society engagement. And In terms of engaging human rights actors, this is the last subsection of the subsection 2. It highlights the frequent problem that I mentioned before of you have development actors not talking to human rights. In the one government reporting to the human rights mechanisms, for example, or doing human rights policy. So the role of human rights actors, among many others, is to be able to make those links. More importantly, the guidance proposes open drafting of VNR reports as one way of formalizing the involvement of civil society. And this approach allows NGOs to review and contribute to the VNR report, either by commenting on what the government has produced or by making their own written contributions. And we will see an example in the next slide. Please, the next slide, where I have selected a few examples that highlight the VNR with various degrees of civil society participation. From less to more, in Mauritius, the NMRF, as you know, the National Mechanism for Reporting and Follow-up, promotes the coordination and collaboration between ministries and departments and consults with the national institution and civil society with a view to reporting to the UN and regional human rights mechanisms and following up on recommendations received. So in its VNR, Mauritius mentions the alignment of its implementation of the 2030 agenda with specific human rights instruments, for example, CEDAW. And Ghana and Guinea-Bissau are interesting examples of engagement with civil society. Ghana organized consultative meetings on 3 issues: youth engagement with SDGs, LNOB, and synergies across the SDGs, with meetings of more than 100 participants from civil society, private sector, traditional authorities, persons with disabilities, marginalized groups. And the outputs are reflected in the VNR report. And as part of the 2022 VNR, Guinea-Bissau organized regional consultations in 9 regions as part of Leaving No One Behind, and the consultations brought together 300 plus participants from civil society and national government. And they were able to discuss key challenges, identify which groups were further behind and propose solutions. And the summary came as an annex to the VNR. And finally, at least at the moment, the case of Finland, in its 2020 report, civil society actors were invited to present their assessment of progress on each goal alongside the official assessment of the government. And in addition, several different non-governmental stakeholders contributed case studies illustrating progress to supplement the main text of the VNR. And they included contributions by the media industry, for instance, on promoting literacy, forestry in terms of sustainability, and the regional government contributions. And this is what we call the open VNRs, the open drafting VNRs. Next, please. So these
Maria,
yeah.
Very sorry to interrupt. Would it be possible for you to wrap up perhaps in the next minute or two?
It is.
Thank you. Yeah. So sorry to interrupt.
I'm finishing. So you can see here the guidance note that it has 8 steps to develop a VNR that integrates human rights. What the guidance does is to break down the items and identify various entry points. Here I leave you to look at all the stages. And just to tell you that there is a role, a very important role for civil society and human rights actors in this guidance note in each of the steps, but I'm showing you, please, can you project next slide, that in the step number 1, for instance, the recommendations in the checklist is that the checklist for each step, there is a checklist with a specific role for civil society. Here you have, for instance, engage key institutional partners working on human rights, NHRIs and others, identify synergies with human rights frameworks. We do not have time to go through all the steps and the role of CSO, but I encourage you to look at the multi-stakeholder validation, the step 6, in which CSOs are encouraged to produce their own shadow reports if they wish, and it was great to hear that Cameroon did it. It is a way to strengthen the impression of diversity in participation. You have to remember that expert bodies, and this is a practice along the UN system, read shadow reports in parallel to the official reports. Step 7 is the presentation at the high level, also includes that involvement of other actors in the presentation. It's a way of signaling the breadth of participation in the report and the range of issues considered, identify them and invite them. And in step 8, finally, the follow-up. The note highlights that it is key to engage human rights actors in follow-up to the VNR and implementation of the 2030 agenda at the national, regional, local levels, particularly when it comes to groups left behind. And finally, my last slide, the guidance is available online. It's in English, we're translating it. Would appreciate your support in familiarizing yourself with it, disseminating it to your networks, and find out how to engage in these processes. Let us know also if it can be improved and how, and we look forward to seeing more good practices and examples in future VNRs. We have a voice. I agree with Toyin. We need more action more than ever. So let's use it. And thank you very much. I look forward to hearing your reflections.
Thank you so much, Maria, for sharing. And for everyone who is in the call and who have also asked in the chat, yes, we will be sharing the resources. We will be sharing this guidance after this webinar. Thank you so much. And so now, without further ado, we're going to invite Ollie Henman. Ollie is the Global Coordinator of Action for Sustainable Development. At the Major Group and Other Stakeholders Coordination Mechanism, he's also a member of the VNR Task. He's a co-lead of the VNR Task Group. Ollie will speak briefly on the civil society preparations at the global level for VNR 2023 and give an overview of how the views of civil society from the grassroots and national levels are carried to regional and global level, and how MGoS coordination mechanism is facilitating the process. Ollie, I know you have a short time, but you have the floor now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Toyin, and thank you to the Women's Major Group for the invitation. It's really great to connect with all of you, and I've been listening in and hearing about all of the great plans and connections ready for next year. As you probably know, Action for Sustainable Development, we often have been supporting national level engagement since 2016, and we've partnered with some of you over the years. I thought that the presentation just now from OHCHR was quite encouraging. It's great to see that guidance note, and I would agree that some of those countries that were highlighted have had some pretty strong engagement. Cameroon, Ghana, both very strong last year. Also interesting to see the example from Argentina and Uruguay last year, and previously India and Kenya, where there's been a really strong effort to have those broad-based dialogues at the national level. So it really has to start from that experience and from your experiences within your countries. Where possible, we provide small grants also to support those kinds of engagements and dialogues and preparation of shadow reports. But today, I'm really here to talk to you about what happens after that. So what happens once you've had your process at the national level, once you've been able to build a dialogue, you've been able to engage potentially with the government, you've been able to engage with the UN country team, the resident coordinator perhaps. How do you then bring that message in to what happens in New York at the HLPF? And so many of you will know of the 21 major groups and other stakeholders, and within that broad range of stakeholders, we've set up collaboratively a task group on the VNRs, as you've just highlighted, and I'm glad to be one of those who's helping to guide that group. And what we do within that group is really open the door and provide space as much as we possibly can to those of you who are active in the countries that are under review each year. So it's a step-by-step process, and again, some of you will be familiar with this, and we look forward to beginning that process for next year shortly. So normally the way we would begin that process, and this will happen by the end of this year, we would have an online survey which is open to any member of any of the major groups and other stakeholders who is active within their country, who is interested to be part of a group to come together and share ideas on the VNR. within their country context. So that is an open survey that will go out, and we'll make sure, Shanaz, I know, will promote that widely. It'll go out to all the different mailing lists so that anyone who's active within a country that has a VNR can then volunteer, can put their name forward to join this working group that we have. And then by early next year, 2023, by let's say January, February, we'll bring together all of those names. And as a working group, we'll work out who's active in each country. Normally, we then identify someone from the coordination group who can act as a kind of focal point to help to convene the initial meeting, to invite in all of those who are active in a country. And we recognize that that's not always easy, and that there may be, at some points, there may be reluctance for some people who may feel that there's a potential for reprisals within their country. And so we try to keep that, that list is confidential. It's not shared even with the UN or with member states. It's something that we keep within the major groups and other stakeholders to ensure that confidentiality. And we set up those calls for those who feel comfortable to be able to join and to be able to start the discussion about how things are happening within the VNR in each country that's coming. As we know, we have about 40 countries again next year. The list is already out, as you know. And so once we've assembled those groups according to each VNR country, the dialogues would then begin around what are some of the priorities for the VNR in that country. And we would then aim to work with you, or in fact, many of you, as you know, would then draft together a short statement that can then be taken to the HLPF in New York, which happens in July. So there's quite a bit of time. We have time from early next year through to July to gather those views, to pull out what are the key issues that are at play in each country, and then define that short statement. And unfortunately, one of the realities is that it's only a 2-minute statement that we have. And you know, many of you have followed this process for a long time, and you'll know that there was a request, there have been various requests to the UN to extend the time of the VNRs, including during the recent HLPF review that took place a couple of years ago. But it's not something that member states were willing to accept. To be fair to the president of the ECOSOC who chairs the meetings, they have always tried to ensure as much time as possible. And in fact, they've reduced the presentation times of the VNRs to allow a little bit more time for questions. You will have noticed that the second and third time round, when a country comes back, they have less time to present, so there's more time for questions. And we've had the guarantee that there's always at least one stakeholder spot to raise a question and to highlight some key points from the stakeholder perspective on each VNR. So that's the kind of end goal, is to get to a 2-minute statement that can then be taken to the HLPF in New York. We know that travel is a challenge, and we were grateful last year, you know, as we've started to go back to in-person meetings, well, actually earlier this year, that the UN was able to provide a little bit of additional support to actually cover the travel for some of the speakers to be able to come to New York from the global south, from developing countries, and in particular to help with visas, because we know the visa challenge is a very, very real challenge. And in some cases, the UN country teams were able to raise the need for faster visas so that people could attend. But all of that is to one side, because ultimately the important point is that this statement should be a collaborative statement. And really the important process is how we get to that statement, so that if in the end we have to change the speaker, we have a statement that has that buy-in, has that equal opportunity for input before it's read. So we recognize that there will always be challenges in terms of the final moment of actually having someone in person in New York. And we also will continue to request from the UN that where it's not possible for someone to travel to New York, if they have been selected by the group within that country as the speaker, that they should also have the opportunity still to speak online on Zoom. And that did happen with about 7 countries in this year. So it's a process that is very much a collaborative process. It's jointly owned by all of us and all of you across all the different major groups and other stakeholders. And we see it very much as a process that embeds rights, gender equality, ensuring that there is a gender balance throughout these discussions. And if there's ever any, recommendations on how we can improve that process, please don't hesitate to reach out through Shanaz and through your teams and through Mabel directly. We can always improve. But I think I like to think at least that we've got a great team and a great collaboration. I'm looking forward to another very dynamic year that's coming up. As we kick off now towards 2023. And we hopefully will have many more of these kinds of webinars also across the major groups and other stakeholders. So please keep an eye out for those as well once the official survey goes out, and we can then have some further follow-ups. So thank you again. I'm sorry I can't stay for that much longer. I have to run to another meeting, but it's been great to connect with all of you, and I look forward to keeping in touch as we go forward. Back to you, Toyin. Thank you.
Thank you, Oli, for sharing with us this afternoon. We appreciate. So the next speaker is Frederick Sotel. Frederick is the Chief Intergovernmental Policy and Review Branch of the Office of Intergovernmental Support and Coordination for Sustainable Development at DESA. Frederick will speak about UN preparations at the global level for VNR 2023 and the official VNR process preparations by UN and member states. Thank you, Frederick, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Toyin, and thank you, Shanaz. And colleagues, my apologies. My director, Marion Barthelemy, who was looking forward to this presentation, was called into another meeting on urgent matter at short notice. This week has been one of those weeks, so but very happy to join you on her behalf. And as time is quite short, I'll take a few points from the slides as we bring them up, but I just want to get some highlights. I think we want to leave enough time for presentation. As we kick off, one thing that struck me, Maria from OHCHR mentioned earlier about the guidelines, and I think that resource that she shared is a very, very good resource. Contains a lot of really good information, and also it links, as she mentioned, to the other existing guidance. So I think there's a tremendous amount of good guidance out there for VNRs. It's building out, and a key point that we've tried to highlight, and I must say hasn't yet got that much traction, but we hope it will with the guidance that's come out from OHCHR, is really linking the VNR preparatory process with some of the other resources out there, especially in the area of human rights, the work of the special procedures, the reporting to CEDAW, and so on. There's a lot of valuable information there which hasn't quite, in sufficient cases, been brought into the VNR process. So hopefully that's something which countries can do going forward, and stakeholders can bring that into the process, because we need to enrich the VNR process with that kind of input. Maybe we can go to I think slide 3. Just moving. Yeah. So how was it addressed in the 2022 VNRs? We see, we prepare an annual synthesis report which looks at all the 44 in 22 VNRs, tries to extract some key points, and we do see quite a good discussion of gender, perhaps not as cross-cutting as it could be, but certainly countries do highlight gender in SDG 5 in their VNRs. Again, of course, as we know from media reports and so on, that an increase in gender-based violence that is reflected in some countries. The reports indicated, it went down. Continue issues around, of course, the gender wage gap and loss of work, and the burden of unpaid care work that is also reflected in the VNR. So we see, I think, in the VNR reports the kind of things that have been coming out from other sources. Next slide, please. So in the as that comes up, in the messages from the ministerial declaration, here we also saw quite a number of paragraphs tackling the gender issue. So quite a serious engagement with the topic. This year's ministerial declaration became a very long document, but overall, in the circumstances, it was adopted by consensus, which given some of the geopolitical issues and other tensions, was quite an achievement. But the document is quite long. The gender issue in some parts, SDG 5 proved to be contentious too, but overall, I think a fairly good engagement with the topic relating COVID recovery, gender responsive COVID recovery, emphasizing the need for the full enjoyment of all human rights. So I think quite a useful engagement in that ministerial declaration this year. Next slide, please. So overall, as we see, with the VNRs, we have almost reached universal coverage. So the VNRs have covered almost all countries, I think, out of an eligible 190 something, because the UN for the VNRs applies a so-called all states formula, which covers some countries that are not member states of the UN. There are only 10 or so missing. So really it's the case now of countries coming for second and third VNRs. And that, of course, touched on some of the points we heard earlier about really being more analytical. So instead of presenting frameworks, let's say on gender policies, as countries tend to do, but really looking at the implementation, 7+ years in, we can begin to maybe draw some conclusions about what's been effective, what kind of changes have been made in response to SDG 5. So that's the kind of thing we want to see more and more now in this generation of third and fourth VNRs, and that's still something where there's still scope for probably some improvement in some cases, but really the VNRs overall in terms of coverage and enormous success. Let's go to the next slide. Maybe we can skip that in the interest of time, and go to the slide looking at stakeholder engagement in the VNR reports. Now, as a rule, many countries will, in fact, most will state that they have consulted stakeholders. And I think, as was alluded to earlier, what is the meaningfulness? What is the depth of that consultation? To what extent did it move from informing and perhaps taking in information, listening, towards actually being responsive? So that's quite hard to judge from the reports per se. But certainly, the expectation is, and I think all countries know this, of engagement and consultation with stakeholders. But of course, over time, the hope is that becomes more meaningful, and that there is actually, bringing that into the policy process using established mechanisms. Of course, also the question being, are some of those mechanisms perhaps, as the speaker from the Philippines said, sometimes the mechanisms described may actually have characteristics which box out or impede true stakeholder consultation and involvement. So that though there's always, of course, a lot of room for improvement. And as we've also tried to indicate when we work with the VNR countries, the need to formalize the process of consultation. So we don't have every 3 or 4 years when there's a VNR presented, that it's a once-off a process, and every time there's a VNR, a new team sort of looks around and sees who are the stakeholders. It should really be formalized, and also ideally there should be focal points and a system of engagement, so that actually becomes part of the bureaucracy that works with the VNRs and continues afterwards. Because of course the VNR is really a means to take stock of implementation, but it's the implementation that we care about. The report is really just a way to monitor and to perhaps map out a way forward. Let's skip the next slide on the reporting. We did have online consultations, and that slide gives a quick breakdown of the responses and the regions. I want to go to the next slide on the entry points for civil society participation. Of course, at the national level, very much dependent on the national government, the openness. As I said, it's very, very clear that the expectation is there. And that we grow that space for consultation. Ideally, the UN country teams are a key resource both for the government, especially in the program countries. Of course, it's the first port of call when countries are not that familiar with the process, or when they need assistance, the UN country team, the resident coordinator's office. But in the same way, the resident coordinator's office can also be a way to strengthen and remind and perhaps cajole or explore all the further options for bringing civil society into the participatory process. At the regional level, and I heard a reference to the Asia Pacific mechanism, we know that the regional commissions that host the regional sustainable development forums have very strong stakeholder participation mechanisms. So those are key areas for engagement through those mechanisms. And then, of course, at the global level, the major groups and other stakeholders that Ollie described, and their coordination and bringing questions and responses into the VNR, as he described, is super important, and especially asking hard-hitting questions, but drawing and referring to the reports. I think it's been very successful, linking it to the material of the report and not, in a sense, to what I would call gotcha questions to embarrass the government, because there may be legitimate reasons to perhaps do that from the viewpoint of civil society, but it doesn't serve our process very well. Whereas if the hard-hitting questions are rooted in the report, that is overall more helpful. Right, now probably the last slide I want to address. Stakeholders can engage through various mechanisms. Here we see some of the platforms. There's stakeholder capacity building workshops that we try and work on. There's material and resources on that. But in the interest of time, let me go to the next slide on the SDG Summit. And this will be my last slide. I just wanted to say a few words about an event that I think will increasingly be drawing our attention, and hopefully that of stakeholders too, namely the SDG Summit. This is the meeting of the HRPF at the heads of state and government in September next year. And it really will be a sort of midpoint review of the SDG progress, and also an attempt or a push to close the gap and sort of reinvigorate action for the SDGs with the horizon of 2030. We're looking forward to working on an inclusive preparatory process, trying to bring stakeholders at the national and the local level into the preparatory process. And the slide sets out some of those key inputs, and the key output there will be a negotiated political declaration. The HRPF in July will sort of pave the way, but it won't have a ministerial declaration. We'll only have an outcome in September, which hopefully will be concise and forward-looking. With that, I thank you and leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Frederick, for sharing. We appreciate your time. So now we are going over to the question and answer section, and we have some questions already. You can still put your question in the Q&A tab. There's an icon for Q&A. You can still put your questions there. But we have a question already, and I think, we would ask all the panelists, to give their input on that. So there's a question from Shanta, and Shanta is asking, what should we do to include Goal 5 and 10, which are for inequalities in each of the VNRs? So we can start with, anybody can jump in first to provide a response to these questions. I hope the panelists heard me.
Perhaps, I can sort of start.
All right, thank you.
Say something.
Maria, thank you. Just a note, if you could come closer to the computer, we can't see your face.
Okay. No, it would be too embarrassing to show too close. So I'm speaking the closest that I can. I think it's a great opportunity for you to look into providing alternative data and analysis on the inequalities on these SDGs. This is the first thing that comes to my mind, and of course, according to the context that you have in your particular country, you will be able to prioritize a few issues. I mean, it is important to prioritize for maximum impact and not try to have to, you know, to do too much and then get lost. So I think it is important in your role to be able to really produce sound analysis and provide data that will be able to you know, supplement the official sort of narrative. I mean, and this is one of the things that are mostly appreciated from civil society organizations, not the only one, but you know, I would like to have the other panelists also provide their views. Thank you.
Hello. I'm sorry, I think my internet.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I got caught up, so I know that one response was being provided. Well, is any other panelists available to just speak shortly to that, or we can go ahead? And also, I can't see any other questions in the Q&A. Okay, thanks, Maria. I can't see any other questions in the Q&A. I don't know if people have put the questions in the chat, but I've also lost my history. So, Shanaz, maybe you could help me if there's any other questions.
Yes, gladly. In the Q&A, we have a question from Isha Miranda. Can NGO representation could have side event at HLPF 2023 with government representatives?
Maybe I can jump in there. Yes, I mean the side events.
Thank you.
Are open. We usually open that in March or April for the HLPF, and we've in the past we had mixed this year virtual and in person. I think we probably will move a little bit more towards in person, which does put a bit more constraint on the space given the rooms that are available. But I think there's no barrier to that. Over.
Thank you so much. Toyin, we have another question in the chat. If you would want me to read it, I'm happy to do so.
Okay, I can read it. So I see here,
okay,
the question is, are any conversations going on about how to better link the VNR process with the regional UN meetings? Would any of our panelists want to respond to that? If there's any ongoing conversations about linking the VNRs to the regional meetings of the UN?
I don't know, Friedrich, if you want to say something, but you know, there are many regional UN meetings, so I'm not sure about what to respond, to be completely honest, but perhaps you have some ideas.
I mean, normally the regional commissions have the regional forums on sustainable development, which are the regional preparations for the HLPF, the common position or the regional priorities, which are then brought and presented at the HLPF. For the VNRs, usually by that time, they're not completed. So the VNRs themselves, of course, the presentation at the HLPF in July. But I know that the regional commissions in these fora They do some, they have regional sort of roundtables, or basically bringing the main messages out from the VNRs without actually yet presenting the VNRs. And they all mostly have quite a strong hand in helping shape and also build the capacity and support for the VNRs. So SCAP is very active, ECA has its own guidelines, and it's very, not guidelines, but actually for local reviews, very active in that area. So a critical sort of, I would say, waypoint and sort of check before the HRPF. And there's a lot of ownership from the regional commissions for the SDG implementation, but also for VNR support. Over.
Thanks, Friedrich. And yeah,
could
go
I
ahead,
come in for
Sinead.
an announcement? Next month, I'm sorry, in November, the Women's Major Group will also hold an annual public webinar like this one on the regional forums on sustainable development, where we will look into this question a bit more as well, to good practices from regions in engaging with VNRs. But definitely can be strengthened, of course, but just a note.
Okay, thanks, Shanaz. I think that's all the questions I can see in the chat for now. And Alessandra is also fine with the response. Thank you, everyone. So if there are no other questions, I think we'll just talk about how to join the Women's Major Group. We appreciate everybody's time today for joining us in this conversation. Like Shanaz has said, the conversation continues. And if you're not already a member of the Women's Major Group, you can actually join the Women's Major Group listserv to get more of this kind of information. If you're participating, if your country is reporting next year, it would be really nice for you to get to know more from all the other information sharing sessions that we will be organizing in the near future. So to join, you can just, there's a link in the chat. I believe Maitri has put the link in the chat. Yes, Andrea has put the link in the chat, yes. So there's a link in the chat. You can follow that link and join the Women's Major Group listserv, and yeah, you become a member of the Women's Major Group. So I see that there's one more question. Is there a question? Okay, yes, there's a question or just a comment. A question from Maria.
Sorry, yeah, Maria was, sorry, go ahead, but Rose unfortunately had to drop because her internet connection wasn't strong enough.
Yeah, it's a pity because it would have been interesting to understand why the civic space for them to participate in the VNR this time wasn't open as opposed to a previous time. So I think it would have been really interesting for us to hear her, but well, technology doesn't allow it. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll be happy to connect you two if you would want me to, for you to be able to ask your question if you want.
Okay, so once again, thank you, everyone. And I'll hand over to you, Shanaz, if you have any last words, and then we can close.
Not at all. I just want to give a very big thanks to all our panelists. We're very exciting to start the 2023 VNRs process. It starts definitely at the national level with your engagement with your governments, pushing them to include the civil society with the important guidance we've heard today from the United Nations. And I think one of the other very crucial points is to use the UN offices, the country offices, is to go to them and ask for their support in the process. But we will be here throughout as the Women's Major Group. If you have any questions at any point, please reach out to us, and we're very excited for the months ahead. Thank you so much, Toyin, as well, for the amazing moderation under hard circumstances, I realize. Thank you so much to the panelists and the amazing interpreters we have as usual. Thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone. Yeah, bye.